Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. From wherever you're joining us, thank you so much for sparing the time to be here with us. I'd like to welcome you to our conversation today. What will it take to feed Africa? The world is at the cusp of a food crisis, and it's been projected that Africa will be most impacted. African Development Bank President Dr. Akinwumi Adesina raised the alarm in May 2022 that as a result of the Russia-Ukraine war, we're likely to see lots of crises surrounding food. So Dr. Adesina warned that the war poses a potential for inland conflicts when people can't afford to buy bread because of high prices resulting from the disruption of wheat supply chains. It is unfathomable that Africa, which consists of more than 20% of Earth's surface, could really be plagued in a food crisis and fail to feed its 1.3 billion people because of a war in Europe. How did Africa get to this position? How did we find ourselves in a position of food dependency? What is being done to manage the imminent crisis? What does future food security look like for Africa? To answer these questions, I'm proud today to be joined by a team of experts in nutrition, international development, food production, and entrepreneurship. Accomplished woman, she is a senior nutrition officer for policy and programs in the Nutrition and Food Systems Division at the Food and Agriculture Organization, headquartered currently on secondment rather at the African Union Development Agency in South Africa. She is the special advisor to the CEO since January 2018. Her work focuses on integrating and mainstreaming nutrition into agriculture and related development agendas, and to promote a multi-sector approach for addressing all forms of malnutrition. She holds a Master of Science in International Nutrition from Cornell, New York, and a Bachelor of Science in Nutrition and Dietetics from Appalachian State University here in the USA. So Ms. Kiyose was awarded a Distinguished Alumna Award in recognition of her exceptional professional achievement by Appalachian State University in 2007. She was also named Senior Policy Scholar in 2011 by the Global Child Nutrition Foundation here in the USA for her work on homegrown school feeding. She has served in numerous international, scientific, technical, and policy advisory committees. I must add that Bibi is well-traveled all over the world. So to get us started on this conversation, I just want to welcome you, and I would like you to just answer the question, why food? And as you answer that, could you just tell us about your work and what you're doing to address the imminent crisis? You're muted.
Yeah, the most common expression nowadays is unmute yourself. So, sorry about that. And thank you, Sombo, for the kind introduction. And it sounds really loaded. Why food? I mean, if we don't eat, we won't survive. It's as simple as that. Food is sustenance. Food is the alpha and the omega of our very existence. Think about it. If we were to not be proud of our culture, not be proud of our tradition, we would have long perished. Because when we think about food, we shouldn't just think about food in the context of feeding us. We should think about it in the context of nourishing our brains, nourishing our spirits, nourishing our souls. So in the context of why food is important, we have to look at it from an agriculture perspective, from a health perspective, from a nutrition perspective to address all forms of malnutrition, undernourishment, macronutrient deficiencies, overweight and obesity, which has become a huge problem, costing millions, if not billions, of dollars to manage this scourge. And we also have to look at food in the context of how it actually helps our human, social, and economic development. I'm happy to report that since 2010, Africa has actually conducted studies called, cost of hunger studies, which have indicated that Africa loses somewhere between 2% and 17% of annual GDP due to child undernutrition. We cannot afford to lose that much money. It is very costly. So preventing hunger and malnutrition is what I'm concerned with in my line of work. Dealing with policy transformation, ensuring there's policy coherence across sectors, because food and nutrition has never been the purview of any one sector. It cuts across sectors: agriculture, health, education, social protection, trade, markets, you name it, and financing, of course. And we also have to understand that when one part of the world sneezes, just like the whole in Ukraine now, we all catch a cold. But should that be the case? I don't think so. Why should we be reliant on external food imports when we can, as Sombo said in the introduction, grow our own food efficiently? See, the trend has been in the last few decades, has been to shift from our traditional indigenous foods that are actually very good, well suited for the agroecological zones, and we know how to prepare them, and we know how to grow them, we know how to preserve them, we know how to serve them. But now we have shifted to unhealthy Western diets that are high in sugar, high in salts, and high in saturated fats. Hence, we are seeing what we call a nutrition transition, which is another area of my focus in terms of educating the consumer to make the right food choices for healthy diets, for longevity, and for productivity. Because if you don't eat well, you cannot produce. I still have to hear of a country that can develop on the backs of a malnourished population. It simply doesn't happen. So our governments must be conscious and conscientious of investing, putting more resources into food and nutrition related issues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bibi, for that introduction. Our next speaker today is Dylas B. Judge. She has an appreciable level of knowledge, experiential skills, and competences in analysis, strategy, and practice in multi-contexts, including development, humanitarian, policy, advocacy, and campaign settings. Dylas is passionate about social policy and social justice, inequalities, and has a keen interest on tackling just the multidimensional inequalities that exist in our society. She is currently the director for Oxfam in Southern Africa. As a development practitioner, she has championed Oxfam in Southern Africa's work on economic justice, gender justice, and accountable governance through developing innovation, program modeling, and contributing to knowledge products and being instrumental in facilitating, building, and nurturing networks and strategic alliances with local movements, national and regional partnerships. I can attest to that because when I worked at Diaconia, Dialis was very instrumental in ensuring that the non-state actor group is really upbeat and we're all doing what we're supposed to be doing as part of that infrastructure. So Dialis holds a master's degree in social policy and research and a Bachelor of Arts degree in development studies. Dialis is a Global Public Voices Fellow with Cornell University here in the USA. So Dialis, I'd like you to tell us what you're doing as Oxfam. Tell us about your work and what you're doing as Oxfam to address the food crisis.
Thank you. Thank you, Sombo. So as Oxfam, we see ourselves as a movement of people that are really fighting inequality so that we can beat poverty and injustice. And we focus on the current situation, but we also focus on the longer term issues. And we think that we're a movement of millions of people that are seeking to build and support communities to build their livelihoods, to grow their resilience, to protect their lives in times of crisis. And so within Southern Africa, our footprint is across the whole SADC region, but we do have a presence in like 4 countries. So that is Zambia, Zimbabwe, Malawi, and Mozambique. Quite a number of things actually that we're doing to ensure that we are investing in supporting food and nutrition across, the different spaces where we work in. So one is that we invest quite a lot of time in ensuring that we do have the analysis that speaks to the issues that, are affecting the communities that we are working with. And if you allow me, at one point, I would like to talk to some of these issues that we've sort of highlighted in the analysis that we've done and relate them in a way that then we can start to unpack, some of the interventions that we're doing as Oxfam, and they speak to things like rising debt, for example. They speak to the impacts of climate change. They speak to the impacts of the pandemic that we've had across, all the different things the different contexts that our communities are faced with. So our work is really based on the solid analysis of the context. We work at the intersections of poverty and inequality, and we understand that inequality drives poverty in a way that it is very interwoven with other, complex issues. And therefore, as Oxfam, we seek to transform the systems that really perpetuate or, make people much more vulnerable. And we try and do that using a very multidimensional approach to, the work that we are doing. So it involves analysis, it involves policy, it involves advocacy, it involves program action. Just to give you an example of some of these areas of work that we do, in terms of humanitarian, we work on, food crisis response across the whole continent to try and meet immediate needs through food and unconditional cash transfers, for example. And this is where we go in the communities that are targeted and support them with these interventions. And then we sort of progress from immediate saving lives interventions into, early and equitable recovery. And this is where we're looking at support through livelihoods. And this might take different forms. It might be assets such as livestock, such as seeds, such as food, such as tools, so that then the communities themselves can be able to pick up and be as resilient as they possibly could be. And then we then move into another phase of economic empowerment and economic inclusion, with a sort of anticipatory action being at the center of all the work that we do. So we don't want to wait for a crisis to happen. We want to anticipate it, and then we want to start to invest in the community so that they can, then be able to, cushion themselves as a first line of defense. And then, of course, there's the aspect of long-term work that we do and then the advocacy work that we do, ensuring that we have accountable governance and ensure that we have proper investments that are channeled to the sector, that we are defining some of the economic models that we think would be working, that we are trying to pull the nexus between the agriculture sector and other sector like extractives. As you will know, countries in Africa are quite resource rich, but how is that nexus between the resource rich extractives, sector and the sector of agriculture, which is holding the bulk of the population of these nations? And so we try and work through some of the models that would then be able to project to government, to the international community, to private sector, in terms of what really could be done to enable communities to be self-sufficient, to produce not just for consumption, but to produce for income. And so there's a whole range that we do on the continuum of saving lives in terms of humanitarian, all the way into development interventions, into the policy space as well. And all these things that all these interventions that we deliver on, we take a partnership approach, because we believe that we need to get closer to local leadership as much as we possibly could, being more empowering of our local partners as well as the citizens that we seek to serve. Yeah.
Piladi is the founder and managing director of African Agricultural Solutions and president of the Ignite Alumni Association. Having been raised in a rural and subsistence farming community and not seeing much improvement in the agricultural sector for so many years, she decided to contribute by setting up her own agribusiness. Piladi ventured into agribusiness because she wanted to create economically sustainable opportunities for underserved communities through agricultural development, and also advocate for the inclusion of rural communities in all aspects of the agricultural value chain. Piladi is a poultry and crop farmer who is also into agro processing. So Piladi, I'd like you to tell us about what you do and also how you're responding to the food crisis. But before that, or in all of this, I'd like you to share your story about what you saw in your community and how you decided to respond.
All right, thank you. Good morning, good afternoon. So yes, I grew up in a subsistence farming village. Yeah, I grew up on a family plot with my grandparents, and my grandmother actually is the one who got me into farming. So she was a farmer. We ate from the plot. We hardly bought any food. Everything was grown there, from fruits, vegetables, livestock. So I grew up around that type of environment. And then obviously, as you grow, I moved on to the bigger cities and got introduced to westernized food, if I should say. And then I studied, went to tertiary in the bigger cities. But as I visited my grandmother all these years, there was no development, and there was everything conducive for commercialized farming, if I should say. So, and my province where I come from, Mpumalanga, it's it's a very green province. It's got a lot of tourist attractions. It's got very arable land. However, there isn't much commercialized farming, which could be optimized to be able to feed the whole province, and if not, country. So I decided to start my own agricultural company to change the mindset that as villagers or people in rural areas could be involved in all the agricultural value chain sectors. We can farm as the bigger farmers who farm on thousands, because in South Africa, there's the very, very, very big farmers, and then there is the smallholder farmers, which I work with, or which I come from the area. So So I decided to start my company, which will focus on creating economic and social opportunities which are sustainable for people, especially in rural areas, who have the resources but don't have the skills or knowledge or access to the relevant information to change their livelihoods. That's what motivated me to start my company, and that's what I've been working on. And just like Buitsepo said in the beginning, that we have our mindsets have been in Africa has been changed to think that the farming that is done in the Western world is how we're supposed to do farming. And I think farming in Africa is what now the Western world is actually adopting. The organic farming, the multi-crop farming, the use of the no use of fertilizers, for example, or pesticides. That's how I grew up being that's how I grew up in the farming environment. So it just goes to show that we have been doing it right. We just need the empowerment and to change our mindsets and focus more on cultural appropriate food production. I think, yeah, that's how that's what motivates me to stay in the agricultural sector.
Great. Thank you so much. Could you tell us what specific aspects of agriculture you're involved in?
I do poultry farming, so layers, which is egg production. And I chose that because of the nutrient value in eggs as a good protein, and it's one of the less expensive proteins, even though the prices are going up in our sector, but it's still more affordable and a good source of nutrients. And I also do crop farming, which I'm trying to work on community-based farming so that there is more volume in the production of certain crops, and especially indigenous crops, which are drought resistant, for example, like cassava, which has grown in my province, but it has not been used in value addition. So that's what I'm working on, as introducing it as a value added crop that farmers can farm, or the community can farm, and which will provide them with sustainability, and also show that their crops, which are considered or were considered unimportant, are actually very high value crops.
Thank you so much. I'd like us to bring back Dylas and Dylas, Mrs. Judge, so that she can share with us in terms of some of the research that Oxfam has done, and just to give a picture of what do the numbers look like, how does this crisis really look like for Africa, and how is this projected to look like in terms of the numbers. And as you do that, Mrs. Judge, I'd like you to tell us just how did we get to this point.
Yeah, really an important question there that we need to discuss and interrogate. 5 areas that I would really like to highlight very quickly here. One is around sector governance. So you will agree with me that agriculture is really a key pillar, and it's defined as such even in the AU's Sustainable Development Agenda. And as the AU puts it, a well-nourished human capital is key for development, because then you derive several other benefits from that. So improved lives for ordinary citizens, higher productivity, higher earnings, improved incomes for people. You can name it as the benefits coming from agriculture. But we know that Africa hasn't been doing very well in this area. And a few numbers out of our research have indicated this. Some of this research is based on the data from FAO, so I would like to acknowledge that data from FAO. For instance, Africa imports a third of the cereals that it consumes. It imports 64% of the wheat, that we need for our pastries, for our bread. And when you look that and compare with the figures that we got from the FAO data, it actually shows that our continent has 24% of the world's agriculture land. And yet we are the hungriest in the world. Like, how can that be? How can we hold so much land and yet we are the net food importer? The FAO report also shows that 800 million people in Africa are facing severe or moderate, food insecurity as at 2021, and that about 282 million people were undernourished in the same period. And so for us, what that means is that we are talking about a sector where people are in agriculture and yet their diets remain unaffordable. We are talking about, the low income bracket not being able to afford even that which they produce. And obviously the impacts of this are huge. And then when you compare this with a country like Ukraine, which holds only about 14% of the land that Africa has in terms of arable land, we were importing from Ukraine. Ukraine was almost able to feed Africa. Now, for us, that's such a huge contradiction in terms of, countries in this region and countries on the continent being endowed with rich farmlands. They have abundant water, and we also have good enough weather. And yet at household level, we have empty stomachs. And so the question is, how can we have empty stomachs in a context where we have everything that we need to be able to be a food basket for the whole country? And I mean, for the whole continent even. And at national level, we are net food importers. So for us, we are saying in our research that that's really a manifestation of a broken food system. It's a failure of policy intervention, but it's also a manifestation of inequality and poverty and hunger feeding off each other. The second thing that our findings highlight is that impact of climate change. So you will agree with me here that Africa contributes less than 4% to global greenhouse gases, and yet we suffer the most impacts of climate change. You will recall in the last rainy season that we had cyclone upon cyclone in a period of 3 months. I think we had like 5 cyclones impacting Madagascar, Mozambique, Malawi, and spilling over into countries like Zambia and Zimbabwe. And the impacts of these extreme weather events are so huge to an extent that our agro-food systems are really overburdened with shocks such as floods and droughts. And what do the numbers look like? In Malawi, we had a total of 91,000 hectares, of farming land damaged. In Mozambique, as a result of Cyclone Idai, we had over 715, thousand hectares of cultivated land damaged. Now, that's huge when you translate that in terms of food security. And then we looked at this in the context of COVID and pre-COVID times. And it's quite saddening to note that even in pre-COVID times, we were still battling, with issues of poor agriculture productivity. And now 3 years on into the COVID pandemic, which has really turned humanity upside down everywhere, we can see that in Africa, there is an economic decline. And that means further vulnerability. And it also has even escalated the vulnerabilities that were there. So if you look at it from the many interactions that we have within the agriculture food systems, we have, food supply chains that are involving, farmers, input suppliers, processors, transporters. All these are impacted by the pandemic. And what that does is that they've also been affected by some of the measures that government has put in place, like restriction of movement of goods and people. And so the ripple effect of that is price hikes. And so the person who is on the lower income bracket would then not be able to afford, a basic meal, as it were. The fourth thing that I would like to talk about, which we're highlighting, is that of rising debt. I think that debt is an issue that we can't not talk about. Our context is one of massive debt levels, and these have really been worsened by interest payments, and we are now seeing dangers of austerity that are coming in. And most of the debt, you will know, is coming from external private financing capital markets. So it's much more expensive than, concessional debt that comes from multilateral institutions. But that crisis of inequality report highlights some of the countries like Zambia, where I come from, that have a debt which is bigger than the economy. And so a lot of our, national budget goes to debt servicing. The Oxfam research indicates that in terms of debt payments, debt service payments in the period 2020 to 2021 in this region, in SADC region, that was about 42.2% of the average revenues in SADC. Now, that's almost half of our revenues going into debt servicing. And so governments are really constrained, and measures that are being put on the table, some of which are also based on the advice even from institutions like IMF, is austerity. But we think that austerity is really not a tool to address debt crisis. We think that it's the wrong direction because austerity really cannot boost that development financing option that we are looking for. And so we think that we need to look at other solutions to Africa's biggest problems in this area. And then the last point that I just want to speak to is that of inequality. And I mean, Oxfam, we talk about inequality in so many ways. Africa is the second most unequal region in the world. 56% of the countries in Africa are within the top 50 bracket, of unequal countries. And when I checked, Southern Africa has 5 countries that are, ranking high in terms of being on the top list. Just to give you a flavor of the economic inequality in Africa is that 19 people in Africa own more wealth than millions and millions of people in the poor bracket in Africa. And then if you look at the richest 1% of the population in SADC, they own more wealth than 48% of the population in SADC. That means that this 1% is holding all these resources that could actually be used to unlock productivity in other sectors. And it is concerning really to see a very tiny proportion of African population capturing all this growth that we talk about and increasingly becoming richer and richer, and then leaving behind the whole population when there's all this thing about do not leave anyone behind. And actually, there's a saying that goes, there's more fruit in a rich man's shampoo than there is fruit on a poor man's table. And I think that is really, really true. And so the people that are on the lower end are then not able to expand their agro-food systems. They're not able to fulfill that sort of production that we have. Now, all these things put together, COVID, climate change, conflict, rising debt, rising inequality, they just reduce the fiscal space of governments in Africa to be able to increase spending in productive sectors like agriculture and food and nutrition. They also just, demonstrate that there's a disconnect between policy and the people, so there's this thing that once we have policy, we actually would be able to solve all the issues. If we look at the AU, I think my colleague would be able to speak to that. We have the CADIP, protocol, their policy. We have the Malabo protocol that says governments should invest at least 10% into agriculture for them to be able to unlock that sector. And what we see from our analysis is that on average, there's an investment of 4.1%. So these numbers are quite telling. And they actually demonstrate that inadequate investments and inadequate actions by our governments, by the international community, by regional bodies, by private sector, are really some of the root causes of the converging crises that have led us into a sector that is not productive, that have led us into being termed the hungriest continent on the globe.
Thank you so much, Dylas. That is very, very mind-sobering. Just the intersectionality of the different, challenges and crises, and just, adding all that and getting us, into where we are at, and just perpetuating the problem that is there. I would like us to bring back Bibi on, and Bibi, I want you to talk to, what are the politics of food? I know that you have traveled all over the world, and in your introductory remarks, you talked about how we have shifted, from indigenous foods to westernized foods. I'd like you to talk to us about the politics of food.
The politics of food are really massive, almost insurmountable, and almost you feel like you are drowning in the noise that is, around how we understand food and how we consume food and how we appreciate food. Let me just start with the reality and the fact that food has always been very political. Food continues to be used as a weapon against the poorest of the poor who actually need it. Most countries, most regions don't have what we call food sovereignty. They don't own their food, their food sources, how they should grow the food, how they should raise their livestock, and how they should be fishing or promoting aquaculture. See, Africa has a really huge biodiversity, but are we taking advantage of that? I would hazard to say we are not even aware of 10% of what we have sitting right beneath us or amongst us, in the wild, in the waters, in the mangroves, in the deserts, in the mountains, in the forests. We are not aware. The research that is done is not done or even designed by the locals. So right there is a problem, because if you are not involved in seeking a solution, in designing your research that is appropriate, that is context specific, then it means you won't even know the results, you won't even understand what is contained in that research. Let me give a very glaringly typical example of the multinationals that are controlling the seed industry. Very sad. Today we've been reduced to producing only using the major staples, the global staples, the four of them, the big four: wheat, rice, potatoes, and maize, all of which are not indigenous to Africa. But we are busy chasing those products because we've been told that since research has been done by the CG system, we should adopt and take on these four staples, to the total neglect of our own traditional and indigenous foods, which we know how to grow. Like I said, we know how to consume. For example, sorghum, millet, fonio, teff, our cowpeas, our other legumes, plenty, and harvesting from the wild. And when we try to convince people or educate people around utilizing their local foods, these foods have been reduced to being looked at as, the food for the poor. Meanwhile, they are the most nutritious foods. Today, if I can tell you, having lived in Europe and America and everywhere around the world, those people are going back to the basics. They're actually seeking out our own foods. Our foods are becoming much more fashionable. The whole industry around insects as food. We've been told that, we can't eat bugs, we can't eat mopane, we can't eat, what do you call it? Yeah. And yet, when we analyze nutritionally these foods, we realize, oops, we have really missed the mark. So going back to the basics, because we don't have food sovereignty, we don't have food justice, we don't have food independence, we are listening to the noises coming from elsewhere that this is what you should be eating. This is the best thing for you. Meanwhile, they know full well that they are controlling the seed industry. So our farmers have to buy the seed, but when they grow that seed, they can't use the seed to replant. They have to go buy again. Right now in Kenya, there's an uproar. There's a policy, a law that says farmers cannot distribute or sell land races. I mean, why should that be? Why should we be told by somebody else what to eat, when to eat it, when to grow it, how to sell it, and to whom we should sell it. Another politics around food is that of we in Africa parceling off our land, selling off our land to foreign producers who come here, produce the food, and take it back to their countries. We don't even see a quarter of that food. It's ironic that our farmers are the most food insecure and the most malnourished. How ironic is that? A very sad case scenario. And another politic to it is the fact, linked to what I said around research, that farmers are usually not involved in the policy setting, program design, and in finding their own solutions. See, we want to always parachute what we deem as modernized technology, modern innovation. We have the innovation right here. When you're sitting on a problem, the likelihood of you finding a solution is right there. But we want to parachute solutions designed in the North and West, which may not even work for us. Then we wonder, why are we not able to produce enough? Because first of all, that research wasn't designed for our, agroecological zones. It wasn't designed to solve our problems. And another reality is that, hunger is huge business. It's sad to say, but it is. Hunger and malnutrition is such huge business. If I can tell you how much goes into these multinationals and organizations really working day and night to make sure that hunger is not eradicated. Because if there's hunger, there will always be somebody who's benefiting from that. And give me an example of COVID also. COVID also showed us the huge cracks in the systems, the weaknesses in the systems. It amplified the whole notion of inequality, as the previous speaker said. So when you realize that who benefited during COVID, we still have COVID, yes, but who's benefiting the most? The pharmaceutical industries. The whole hoarding of drugs, the whole hoarding of vaccines, because they're produced by somebody else, having patents. Why should you patent something that is not yours, especially in terms of our biodiversity? Why should our gene banks be outside Africa? Those are questions, as Africans, we must really look hard at and find solutions. We are the people that can provide solutions and stop the politics of food and nutrition once and for all. If we can't do that, then we'd have failed our generations to come. That's what I posit. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's really strong, and you've made me learn a lot more about just what goes on and how this whole food sector and food industry is a multi-billion-dollar business. You talked about the exclusion of farmers in decision making, and also just how that has led to farmers having to keep going back to go and buy seeds. I remember growing up, we would use the same seeds. You use the seeds this year, and part of the harvest, you have to take good care of it. You put it aside, you make sure it dries out nicely, and then next farming season we have the seed that we are going to use. So it's really, really interesting to see how food is really big business, but food is also a political tool. And now we are seeing that we cannot say that this is not in my backyard kind of problem anymore. Food is everyone's business, and it is everybody's problem, as has been exposed by the Russia and Ukrainian war. I would like us to bring on stage Piladi, and Piladi, I want you to talk about what the main challenges are in terms of food production. You are a producer of food. What do you see as the main challenges as you've been engaging in this sector over the years?
The main challenge is one of the biggest ones, and especially representing the younger female agripreneurs on the continent, is the fact that we are female. There is a lot of prejudice, especially when you want to do commercial-based agribusiness. Most of the agribusiness is associated with males. Females are only stereotype to be involved in food production when it comes to the basics of providing for your family, or just the basics of planting in your back garden, but not the secondary parts of the agricultural value chain, like agro-processing, or even other parts of the value chain involved in in processing and other aspects of the value chain. So we're only associated with doing the menial labor in agriculture. That is the first hurdle which most of our agripreneurs experience on the continent or in the agricultural sector. The second problem is that accessing information is very difficult for most farmers in Africa. We don't have data, especially when it comes to our farming practices, whether it's to do with the soil or seeds, as has been highlighted. We don't own much of the inputs that we use in our farming practices, or we don't own it, or it's very expensive for us to be able to afford to do the most suitable type of farming we want to do. So in terms of information as well, for example, most farmers were affected by COVID, were affected by the weather, the climate change that is affecting us. So we don't have much information about that, and especially the farmers or the locals at the grassroots who are in places like villages. They don't have the information that is relevant to them or communicated in a way that they would understand. It's quite top level kind of information that is communicated. Also, I think the other challenge is that, like I said, we don't own parts of the agricultural value chain which make the most money. So we don't have enough investment or input in parts of the value chain which deal with technology, innovation, as well as machinery. And we always have to go look to the West for those kind of solutions. And the issue with that also is that for consultation, we always have to go back to the West for information or to fix our problems when we actually do have the solutions. My grandmother was processing maize, for example, or sorghum, just using a simpler form of machinery. But now everything is so commercialized, everything is so capitalized that it's very difficult for us as farmers, and especially as emerging young farmers, to afford all this type of machinery or technology, which we could be empowered to develop right here in our own countries on the continent. And then also, the other part is that we are often limited in how we access information, like I said, but in this term, I mean that most of the youth in Africa don't have access to what it actually means to be involved in the agricultural value chain. We're only taught about planting, the primary, and that's why most youths don't believe that farming has money or farming is a respectable job. So I think more focus on as Ignite likes to say, we like to make farming sexy for women because it will attract women and not associated with, women just burning in the sun all day. There are much more parts of the agricultural value chain, like policy or innovation. So those are the challenges. And another major challenge, actually, which we struggle with, is access to land. Like I said, most land also in Africa is made available to the males and not females, even though most of the females are the one who work on those lands. So those are some of the major challenges, and obviously the major challenge is funding. But I'm sure if we can have access to land, to information, and being able to be empowered to come up with our own solutions like technology and machinery, we're halfway there. I believe the money will come after that. But if we don't have the ability to play in those sectors, then we will struggle to get over any other challenges that come our way.
Mhm. Thank you so much, Peladi. Thank you so much. That is well said. Um, I'd like us to answer the last question in this conversation today before we move to our person joining us in the audience today. And the last question that I have is, just how can we achieve food security? And I would like to start with Dylas. I'd like Dylas to come up and just share with us, how Oxfam thinks, Africa can achieve food security. And after that, we'll have Bibi and Peladi will come back on set to address the same question. So, Dylas, could you tell us how can we achieve food security as a continent long term?
Yes, indeed. We think that Africa is able to produce enough food supplies for consumption and for income as well, but for food security ultimately. And we think that we can achieve that in a way that everybody gets an equitable share and access to that food. Because like we pointed out earlier, we do have the right conditions, right? In terms of farmlands and water and enough, or good enough weather to make us a food basket. So what needs to be done? One, I think, is this aspect of transforming the agriculture and food systems. And how do we transform agriculture and food systems? So the first point for us is increasing investments to the sector. And it's not just about the quantity of investment from the current law of 4.1 to at least 10%, which the heads of state have agreed to in the Malabo declaration, but the quality of the investments as well to enable agriculture diversification, to happen. And we think that that investment should have a strong bias on smallholder producers or smallholder farmers. Quite a number of countries are riding on, full liberalization of the agriculture sector. And what that does is enables the commercial farmers to benefit more. But I think we're talking about quality and quantity of investments that are targeted at smallholder farmers. And like Bibi had earlier said, we also think that besides targeting the smallholder farmers, we should also be able to target climate and nutritionally sensitive local food systems. So we spoke about the sorghum, we spoke about, the millet, which is quite resistant to drought and things like that. And we think that they can significantly contribute to healthy foods and diets to an extent that we're then becoming food secure. There's quite a lot of dependency on external markets. If we did invest in smallholder agriculture and in those types of food crops that are climate sensitive, I think that we could significantly increase the resilience of our production of the smallholder farmers, and we would not then be depending on external markets. We would not be running to Ukraine, looking to import wheat, as it were. So that's one area that we think. The second area is that we need to start to redistribute resources that are coming from other sectors like the extractive sector into other productive sectors like agriculture. And how can we do that? Progressive taxation would be one of those ways that we can, start to redistribute, our financing for investment in agriculture. Most of our governments are offering very, unnecessary, if I can put it that way, incentives to multinationals. And I think it's time that the multinationals made a fair, a pay of their share of taxes. And we need to be able to strengthen fiscal laws and policies so that we have things like tax avoidance, are curbed. As you know, there's so much that we lose through illicit financial flows, and all that is investable income. I mean, truth be told, what we get in aid is much, much less than what we lose through illicit financial flows. And if we can plug some of those leakages, we would be able to have that investable kind of of income in our national budgets, domestically resource mobilized and channeled towards the vital sectors. The last thing that we think we need to work on is start to engage with multilateral, bilateral institutions to support some of the initiatives in agriculture, but these should not be driven from there. They should be driven from the national context. What can some of these look like? I just want to give an example here. So we do have what they are calling the special drawing rights, and this is sort of some liquidity that is given to countries to enable them cushion some of the pressures that countries are experiencing. And particularly in the wave of COVID, we've seen that countries have been allocated, rich countries have been allocated in excess of $400 billion of special drawing rights. These have been issued to high income countries, but how much of that is really being utilized by high income countries? Maybe it's time we needed to have that conversation and say, can they repurpose that money and get it to the low income countries, and then deliberately put conditions around this is for agriculture, targeted towards smallholder farmers. So I think there's quite a lot that they can do. And of course, from a reparations perspective, we should also be expecting that there'll be increased aid. But I also want to say that there's something that farmers themselves can do. Farmers like Piladi can do. So farmers really have a significant role, and we think that farmer agency is really, really key. If we can get into a space where they're able to build that agency around themselves, they will be able to support a number of things like functioning local markets. They'll be able to ensure that local food security needs are met. They'll be able to stimulate the local economy. They'll be able to add, value to some of the products that they are, putting in the local market. So the farmer agency is really important. And the farmer collectives as well would then be helpful in terms of organizing, even if it were for skills building, even if it were for farmer engagement on policy. I think that the farmer-led movements are going to be quite significant to counter some of the power that we have in organized business and engaging at the policy level with state. We think that a well-organized, a well-informed, farmer collective is capable to work even across borders and start to negotiate a stronger position for themselves. So those are some of the things that we want to emphasize on, among several other interventions like land tenure for farmers. Otherwise, you can't make an investment if you do not have secure land tenure.
Bibi, Bibi, I would like you to share your remarks on how Africa can achieve food security. You've worked in this sector for a long time, and yeah, could you just
Absolutely. Maybe let me answer the question with a series of questions, just to challenge ourselves, to push the envelope. Because when you look at how can we achieve food security, the question would be, how did we as Africa get to this point? And what are the challenges of actually achieving food insecurity, rather achieving food security? Well, the first thing that jumps to my head is, are the global trade policies fair? There's a huge protectionist movement that has always been there. We are forced to buy other people's commodities, and yet they may not want to buy our commodities at a fair price. Who sets the price? We don't always set the prices. The prices are determined by the WTO or by anybody else. We don't have the space at the table to negotiate, on a fair way. In a fair way. So we are always left to the whims of those that have power, of those that have the wherewithal to convince everybody. So that's the first thing. So if we can flip these things around and say Africa should have a voice in these global trade negotiations so that we're able to have a fair share of how we trade, what we trade, and how much we get out of it. And the next thing is, do we as Africans generally consume what we produce? I would hazard to say, we normally don't. In the bigger scheme of things, we don't. We rather consume what we don't produce. Why should I be buying tomato paste and chopped tomatoes from Italy when I can have an equally good local, produce, processed and put on the supermarket shelves? And why should I not be given the wherewithal, the technologies to process and sell my own food? So that's improving, food processing, improving, everything along the value chain would actually ensure that from farm to plate, we don't lose anything in between. And speaking of which, food losses are huge. Losses due to, let's say, for example, mycotoxin in the different forms, maize, groundnuts, that's where you find, So that food cannot be consumed because if food is not safe, it is not food, period. So if we can minimize the mycotoxins and other agents, antimicrobial diseases, we'll find ourselves in a better space where what we produce is actually fit enough to go into our stomachs. So attending to that, food safety issues and reducing food losses. And then, are we supporting more micro enterprises, women and the youth in agriculture? I don't think we're doing enough. We are paying lip service to it. And yet these are the groups that can actually help to bolster our production, our processing, our marketing, and our education, insofar as looking at agriculture and food production and along the whole food systems chain, that actually investing in agriculture is great business. Investing in agriculture is good for food, is good for nutrition, is good for your development, is good for your sanity. And the other thing, it was mentioned, climate change. We are not the ones who have contributed to the carbon emissions, yet we are seeing, as a result of climate change, more deserts, more floods, rising temperatures, and our soils are getting more and more leached by the day. How can we improve and have better climate smart agriculture and really be in a position to kind of move away from the various things that have leached our soils? Chemical fertilizers, we all know the story. And yet these fertilizers are being shoved down our throats as if it is the last thread we have to hang by. No. Did we use chemical fertilizers in the good old days? No. We used, manure. We used organic fertilizers, which actually give back, feed nitrogen back into the soil. So improving fertilizer promotion and, using, multiple cropping, not monocropping. Because nowadays, somebody that grows maize only. Do you think the land is going to, to sustain that? No, we have to go back to, not, move away from monocropping, have, legumes, have melons, have sorghum, have this, in one plot, and do crop rotation. Really going back to the basics. There's nothing innovative about innovation that doesn't work for you. And speaking of innovation, we really should be conducting appropriate context-specific research and not only stop there, but enforce dissemination of these innovations and technologies. And when I talk about innovation and technology, I'm not talking about some high-level, high-end street anything. No, we have the technologies. But we have neglected these technologies because they are deemed less productive or less, or less efficient. And that leads me to another point of the fact that, we really are not optimizing our land use. So we need to look at how can we really improve the way we use our land and the way we actually do the best we can. And that way we can be able to sustain our production systems and our food systems and our nutrition systems so as to sustain our own personal health, societal health, and economic development health. Healthy planet, healthy food, healthy people, sustainable future. Over.
Thank you so much, Bibi. Thank you so much for your contribution on what we should do to have sustainability in the future. At this time, I would like to ask Peladi to just quickly, make a contribution on that. What do you think we need to do as Africa for us to achieve food security? And after that, we'll ask Mr. Ndlovu, who's joining us in the audience, to ask a question. Peladi.
Right. I think the major thing that we need to do as Africans is to lead the policy discussions and lead because we own most of the arable land. We have the favorable conditions to grow food for the whole world, actually. So we should lead the policy talks and not accept policies as they are from the West. I think that would be a great start for us. And then also industrialize rural communities to be able to partake in agro-processing and other parts of the value chain, not just primary, because most times food is grown in the rural areas, but it's moved to the cities, and then it comes back to the rural communities, which it makes it more expensive. At the end of the day, rural communities can't even afford the food that they have produced. So decentralizing the industrialization in Africa would be a good step to take as well. And also focusing on territorial markets, growing the food in the rural areas, having markets there so that it decreases the cost at the end of the day, like I said. And now also with the fuel costs, food is forever increasing on a monthly basis because fuel costs are increasing, because food is being moved from the primary producers and taken back to them. And then lastly, focusing on mixed farming and agroecology practices is what we were taught growing up, and it did contribute to a lot of successful farming and food security in most villages. Now all of that has been taken away because of the new way of farming, monocropping or commercialized farming, which is based more on bigger quantities and less quality, I believe, even though it's classified as more quality than mixed farming or rural farming. And then also lastly, the costs associated with practices like agroecology, which were already there in African communities. For example, now we have to pay ridiculous amounts to be certified that you farm organically, even though those communities have been farming organically. And because they cannot get or pay that amount to certify themselves, then they are excluded from those high value agricultural niches. So I think those are some of the things that we need to focus on, but most importantly, focusing on policies which is driven and developed by the Africans and not the West.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Peladi, for that contribution. We have a person joining us in the studio audience today. Mr. Ndlovu, could you come through and ask a question? I think we'll only have one question in the interest of time.
So thank you, Dr. Sombo, and thank you. This has been very informative and enlightening at the same time. It's always good to learn something new. So the question that I have, I think the question is going to be open to any person. Feel free to take a stab at this. Why do you think, what it would take the African governments, because they are the ones who are in the position for the most part to move this agenda of ensuring that Africa has the food that it needs to feed its people? What is the role of the international organizations and what is the role of the African government?
Okay, let me take a stab at it. Insofar as African governments are concerned, let me just be sort of politically incorrect while being correct. See, the biggest elephant in the room, let's call it by its name. Let's call it out. Corruption. We are not putting our money where our mouths are. We keep tiptoeing around this issue as if it is going to just evaporate by itself. That's one. So how do you address corruption? How do you root out corruption? There should be strong checks and balances to ensure accountability. Our leaders are not accountable. I don't know where, when, and how the wheels came off the cart. So if we don't hold our leaders accountable for the job they should be doing, and we should be educating the populace, the citizenry, to really start asking the right questions and demanding answers. Another thing is, if we don't look at how our policies are structured, look, Africa doesn't like policies. We have plenty of them, gathering dust. So we have the policies, but we're not translating them into actionable things. So we have them sitting. And the other thing that, is an Achilles heel is that we tend to have government policies and not national policies. So if this government is overthrown tomorrow, policies get thrown out. We start all over again. No, that shouldn't be the case. We should build on what works and really understand what works and how we can have a multiplier effect around that. And of course, we have to build capacities. We cannot have farmers producing that don't have the education, the information, the tools to do something. And then, of course, we have to make sure that we improve our investments. Those really go without saying. And the role of international organizations is to work hand in hand with African governments and not claim to have an upper hand. Just because they may have the book knowledge doesn't mean that they have the practical knowledge that should be imparted to the farmers on the ground. Over.
I'd like to add on what Beitepo said with regards to the policies or implementation of policies when it comes to government departments and international organizations. Most time, international organizations and government leaders at the top are the ones who communicate or who interact, instead of starting from the grassroots, interacting with the people at the grassroots, like the farmers or the locals who have been living off the land for all these years. So I think there's a disconnect there. Instead of focusing on the top, top communication or communication amongst the leaders at the top, we should start focusing on bringing in the people at the grassroots as well when it comes to consultations between those two organizations.
And maybe just to add to that, there's this saying that he who pays the piper calls the tune. And we see a lot of that playing out, in our context. If you go to negotiations, like Bibi was saying, chances are that your air ticket is paid for by someone, your hotel accommodation is paid for by someone, even the food you're going to eat is paid for by someone. So how do you get into a conversation around meeting your financing needs when you can't even take yourself to the negotiation table? Essentially, you are not sitting at the table, you are the menu and they dictate, what comes to you as imports, how much you're going to get that import for. And this is why you see in African governments, for example, we trade more with the outside world than we trade within, Africa, because we are not in a position where we are using our resource wealth to, build our power for us to be able to engage in meaningful conversations in the international scene, and then translate that into national policies. So what we end up seeing is a lot of contradiction in policies because we are pushed left, right, and center by the powers that be. I think Africa needs to work out its solutions, and we need to be able to have, the international community supporting solutions that are homegrown. And homegrown means that we invest in things like action research, that we are including, the people that we seek to save in a process of co-creating these solutions and really testing them out and only adopting those that work, rather than, importing solutions that definitely will not work.
Thank you all so much for this very interesting conversation that we have had today. Very, very informative. I've learned a lot. I have learned a lot, and I'm very hopeful that the people that are watching right now are also learning a lot. And I hope that from this conversation, we will be able to, just take this forward, see how each one of us can be able to work together to get this message out, but then also to work on actual practical things that we can work together to demand for that accountability that we need to demand for from the governments, and also to provide the right kind of support for those that are putting money and investing in the agriculture sector. I sat here and I was thinking to myself, this is really interesting because it sort of came full circle. I studied agriculture science in high school, and I really, really loved it. I'm very passionate about farming, and I haven't really done work around policy in farming, but I have a small farm. So I love to farm, and it's food is everybody's concern. Food is not something that you can stand back and say, this is not in my backyard, I'm not going to have anything to do with this. Food concerns everybody. And to just have this high level conversation that connects all the different pieces, I think is something that is really, really exceptional. And I want to thank each one of you for your contributions and for bringing your knowledge to this conversation, and for just getting us, for just getting us, fired up, that we need to carry this forward. So I will end this conversation here for today, and I hope that we will generate more, discussion around this. And I'm really, really grateful and honored to have had all of you here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.